All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. And this, of course, is coming from Japan, where it is a pretty big victory for the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. His ruling party has managed to hold on to its single-party majority in the Japanese parliament. Now, Kishida's Liberal Democratic Party has defied expectations, and it has now gone on to claim 261 seats, exceeding the majority of 233 seats. The single-party majority is, of course, a big victory for the 64-year-old Kishida, who had taken charge of Japan on the 4th of October. Initial exit polls had suggested that the LDP would need to rely on its coalition partner for a majority, but it has defied expectations with its junior coalition partner, Komeito, claiming about 32 seats. The coalition now has a total of 293 seats in the Japanese legislature. The vote was, of course, a test for Fumio Kishida and also for the LDP party. The party has dominated Japanese politics for at least 7 decades, but was lambasted for its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kishida has promised to focus on defense and has also pushed to increase military spending. He's also vowed to strengthen the Quad alliance as well. India, United States and Australia are a part of the alliance, which aims to counter China's expansionist ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. Kishida's predecessor Yoshihide Suga stepped down in September after just a year in office. The resignation came amidst plummeting poll ratings for the LDP, following a very unpopular push to continue with the Tokyo Games despite concerns about the surging COVID-19 cases. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what this electoral victory means for the new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for Japan, we're joined in by our correspondent Phoebe Amoroso, who's joining us live from Tokyo on this broadcast. Phoebe, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this broadcast. And let me begin by asking you this. Fumio Kishida, the man who took charge of Japan on the 4th of October, he called for the elections on the 14th of October, and he's now pulled off an unexpected total majority in the Japanese legislature. What does this mean for Kishida's tenure at the top?
This is undoubtedly very good news for Prime Minister Kishida. Japan has a record of so-called revolving door prime ministers in and out of office within a year. And when Kishida took over as leader of the LDP last month now, there were doubts about how long he would last in office. He's seen as someone that is fairly bland in his image, lacking in charisma. And in that sense, there were concerns that, yes, he would not last too long. Now, with the LDP, the public have been incredibly frustrated over the past few months with the previous administration's COVID-19 response. So they were always predicted to lose seats in this election. However, they have lost less seats than expected. And in that sense, Kishida is calling this a really big deal. It gives him a strong mandate to lead. Now, when he did take over as leader of the LDP, we did see an unusually negative reaction in the markets. Normally, a new leader buoys investment sentiment, but he had proposed some policies on wealth inequality that got investors worried, and this led to a Kishida shock, so-called Kishida shock, with stocks declining for 8 days straight. However, now we're seeing a complete opposite reaction. In fact, the markets were trading up by 2.4% at one point this morning, as there's a huge sense of relief. This is now viewed as a strong victory for the LDP, and that Kishida will stay in power at least for the next year or so. And that will be bring political stability to the Japanese environment, and it's something that is causing a huge amount of relief among investors, but also globally, that Japan will have some kind of political stability going forward.
I think that's the important takeaway, stability for Japanese politics, especially in terms of the premiership. Now, the question that a lot of people will be wondering is, how different will Fumio Kishida be from his predecessor, Yoshihide Suga, was seen as someone who is overbearing in his style of leadership, who is not willing to listen to the voice of people. Will Fumio Kishida be different?
That is a big question, and in some sense the LDP have maintained their stronghold on power because they do represent the status quo. There are differences within the party, but they have maintained a fairly solid direction. When it comes to how much Kishida will differ from Prime Minister Suga, it really depends on the internal dynamics within the party. There are still many allies of former Prime Minister Abe and also Suga within the party, and they have a huge amount of power. So we've already seen that Kishida's policies have wavered more to the right. He traditionally leads a faction within the LDP that is very dovish, but as we've seen from his proposal on defence spending, proposing it could exceed more than 2% of the GDP, where it's always been capped around 1% of Japan's GDP, that's a stronger push for the more right-wing side of the party. We've also seen him backtrack on his statement regarding reviewing capital gains. So there's a sense that how much he can actually forge his own path with his policies, his hands are going to be somewhat tied. He's promised that he will diverge away from Abenomics. He criticised the sort of neoliberal policies that did not lead to trickle down to everyone within Japanese society, leading to growing income inequality. But on that front, he's promised wealth redistribution as well as growth, but it's very unclear at the moment as to how he's really going to deliver on that, and certainly there will be politicians within the party pushing for a growth-first focused approach.
All right, my last question to you is, what will be on the agenda for Fumio Kishida? What are the big challenges that he will have to address in his very first 100 days in power?
Well, immediately he will be flying to Glasgow, Scotland to take part in the United Nations Climate Conference COP26. And this will really be a chance for Kishida to raise Japan's profile on the global stage for a really critical issue. He's inherited some very ambitious decarbonisation goals from Prime Minister Suga. Japan has promised to reduce its carbon emissions but a 46% of 2013 levels by 2030. And there's also a target for carbon neutrality by 2050. But it's yet unclear as to how Japan will be reaching these goals. A basic energy plan drawn up by the government over the summer has called for a doubling of renewables, but there's no clear strategy on how that is going to be implemented. And Japan has also, out of step with many other advanced economies, not promised to completely step away from coal. So it might be that Kishida really feels the heat during the meeting, given that Japan's policies are slightly out of step with other climate leaders. Then there's the case of the economy, and just last week the Ministry of Finance downgraded Japan's economic outlook. Kishida's first task will be to draw up his promised stimulus package of trillions of yen. Many are waiting to see what that will look like. Then there is also the concerns over the pandemic that are still lingering. Cases have really dramatically dropped here in Japan, but as the country reopens, there is a risk of a rebound. So how the administration prepares for any future health crisis will also be a big focus.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Phoebe Amoroso, for joining us from Tokyo and getting us all those updates there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.